makers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, in a moment, we'll be taking a much closer look at what the markets make of that latest U.S. CPI data with Morgan Delladonna, head of investment strategy in Europe at Global X, and also Bloomberg's Christine Aquino. But first, Joe Biden has vowed to stay in the presidential race, but two critical mistakes have deepened concern about his mental acuity and physical health. Now, speaking at the NATO summit in Washington, Biden mistakenly introduced Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskiy as President Putin.
Now I want to hand it over to the President of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. He's going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway, Mr. President.
I'm better.
You are a hell of a lot better.
I'm now joined by Stephanie Baker, senior writer on Bloomberg's investigations team, who also has a wonderful book out, I think, in September, that we'll mention in a second, in September, on actually Putin and the war efforts. But Stephanie, I mean, I feel like the Democrats just lost the narrative, like Joe Biden has now lost the narrative. I mean, he did two gaffes. It was all over Twitter. It was like memes. I mean, how does he get away from this?
I know. I mean, ironically, this was probably his best unscripted performance since the disaster of the debate. And it showed his incredible command of foreign policy, from Ukraine to China, which has always been his forte. And in contrast to Trump, I think. But like you said, it was overshadowed by these two big flubs, notably the calling Zelensky Putin, which has already a clip that has already gotten 8 million views on TikTok, and then calling Vice President Trump, referring to Kamala Harris as Vice President Trump. And again, I think what's happened is that there's now such a focus on his age that every little gaffe is going to get displayed on social media, clipped and memed, and it's going to overshadow his campaign. So there's going to be this incredible, he's going to be under a microscope for the next four months until the election. And I think that's going to be very hard for him to weather.
So at this point, Stephanie, I mean, can he actually stay on as candidate? Can he even stay on as president?
I think the next weekend is crucial. And I think there have been a lot of Democratic representatives, senators who have been holding back because of the NATO summit. They did not want to embarrass the president before that. And I think there is an expectation that the dam will break and there'll be a flood of additional Democrats coming out calling for him to step aside. So I think this weekend is crucial. What you saw from that performance, though, last night was that he is defiant. He is determined to stay in. But he has to sound that way. Any hint that he might be considering stepping aside, and then it's game over.
I mean, does this all overshadow also, some of the work that NATO is trying to achieve? Does it actually, until it's resolved, does it overshadow everything the president is trying to touch?
I think in terms of the NATO summit, it went very well. I think it overshadowed the summit insofar as various other world leaders were asked to defend Biden. But they reassured Ukraine, probably not as much as Ukraine wanted. There's no clear timeline for Ukraine to join NATO. And I think you saw the pictures of Zelensky last night looking disappointed, probably because there is no clear timeline, in addition to being referred to as Putin. But I think the substance of the foreign policy is still going forward. There is still strong support for Ukraine. There is still a tough position on China. I don't think that's not being really undermined.
Stephanie, you're also like a newly minted author, right? The book Punishing Putin is coming out in September. Disclaimer, I pre-ordered on Amazon.
Excellent.
So that is good news. But there was this, crazy story yesterday about, some of the allies foiling this Russian plot to kill the chief of the German defense company, Rheinmetall. I mean, what does this tell us about Putin's state of mind?
It shows that, he has been running this hybrid shadow war for years now, but it looks like he's really stepping it up. He's faced with a united NATO and increased military aid to Ukraine, and he's determined to try to undermine that at every step of the way. And I would expect more from Russia on that front. That sort of, KGB, FSB operations in Europe to try to divide and target defense industries that are funding and providing weapons to Ukraine.
Stephanie, thank you so much. Stephanie Baker there from Bloomberg Investigations and, of course, author of Punishing Putin. Now, to talk about the market implications of all of this, but also some of the data that we had yesterday, U.S. inflation cooled broadly in June, driven by this long-awaited slowdown in housing costs. Now, let's talk to Morgan Delle-Donne, Global ex-head of investment strategy in Europe, and Bloomberg MLive's Christina Kina. So thank you both for joining us. Christina, it's very clear that it's Biden, Biden, Biden. It's our most read stories. It's what people are talking about. Is there a market reaction to this, or is it just too soon because we don't know if he steps down, who could take place?
Yeah, Francine, I mean, that's exactly it. It's too soon to really know or get any certainty in terms of what happens if he does step down, because there are still several steps and several months, really, until we get to the election. But rest assured, though, traders are, in fact, looking at this. And there's probably potential for some kind of knee-jerk reaction, depending on when we might get the news, if we get the news, right? It is usually likely for these sorts of announcements to happen outside of market hours, which is going to be incredibly inconvenient for any of us watching markets. And so, you would probably expect kind of some kind of initial reaction probably happening perhaps in currency markets. They're kind of like the first port of call when it comes to big political upheaval such as this, potentially. But moving on from there, in terms of the concrete implications, where does it take the Democrats? What kind of policy would they try to sell to voters come November? And how does that stack up against the Republican Party's own policies? I mean, so many questions up in the air. You can imagine investors kind of wanting to watch this, but not necessarily acting on it until there's more certainty.
Yeah, they're also very busy with the Fed. We had that inflation print. I mean, Jay Powell, Morgan, wanted a good inflation print. He got it, and now the market is pricing in a cut in September.
Yes, it's very interesting to see that the market is still falling into the same optimism that we saw earlier this year. Every time there is a positive news, there is kind of an over-optimism around it. And looking at the details of the report, you can see that, yes, this is good news because even shelter indices, probably more domestic inflation is slowing down, but it's still well above target. We are 1 point above target. And meanwhile, we are seeing other developments outside the U.S. that could threaten the inflation outlook. Looking at freight costs, for example, they have almost quadrupled since November. This could translate into higher PPI numbers today, but even a strengthening trend in higher production costs, which ultimately will weigh on inflation. So, yeah, I think that's something to watch.
Yeah, Christina, and we saw this, very quickly. We saw this massive rotation, actually, yesterday. Is the market getting ahead of itself?
I mean, that's always been a question, especially for equity markets, right, Francine? There's always been such worry, despite the fact that we've seen, how many record highs for the S&P 500 this year? I think it was 36 last time I looked. But there's always been this worry that couldn't possibly last very long, right? There's bound to be some kind of pullback here. And so now that we're kind of seeing more input in terms of inflation, potentially buoying treasuries again, it seems like some market participants definitely taking the opportunity to rotate back into fixed income from stocks.
Great. Thank you both. Christina has to head to radio before the executive producer wages war on me. Bloomberg's MLive, Christina Kina, and Morgan Delle-Donne, Global X's head of investment strategy in Europe, stays with us. Coming up, 3 U.S. banking giants kick off the earnings season later today. More details on what investors will be looking out for next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back, everyone. Now let's return to Morgan Delle-Donne, Global X's head of investment strategy in Europe. Morgan, when you look at, thank you so much, first of all, for sticking around, but we're talking a little bit about inflation and the fact that maybe the market is getting a little bit of ahead of itself because it was one inflation print and finally they're saying, great, the war is over against inflation. Is there a danger that actually they have to reprice if we're starting to get, pressures, as you were mentioning, in certain parts of the economy?
I think what really takes center of the stage now is politics and how that could have implications on the inflation outlook, especially if you look even beyond the US. The rise of populism, the threat of higher tariffs, that could really push inflation upward globally. And the US wouldn't be immune to that. So even like beyond the US, there is a threat to this inflation trend. But also domestically, depending on the outcome of the presidential election, higher protectionism, higher tariffs, possibly extension of the tax cuts and job acts from 2017 beyond 2025 could have implications on the fiscal stance and lead to higher rates as well, but also stimulate the economy to a point that inflation is not actually going back to 2%. So for all these reasons, I think the window is closing in terms of when the Fed could act. The market seems to be pricing 2 rate cuts, which seems reasonable, but I don't think that the Fed would have time to go much more than that.
Yeah, I mean, the concern is also unemployment, right? Unemployment is, got to 4.1%. Like, are we going to see this kind of like protracted, tick up in unemployment that warrants a cut?
Yes, but looking at historical levels, even if yes, there is an uptick in unemployment rate, it's still 4.1%, which is quite low considering like a longer time frame. And at the moment, activities in the manufacturing sectors, in services, are still in the expansion territory. So there is no real material threat to the U.S. economy, apart that, yes, there is a slowdown, but not something dramatic. So I wouldn't expect a sudden and significant easing cycle.
Morgan, thank you so much. Morgan Deladonna, they're a global head of investment strategy in Europe. Now, let's also talk about U.S. banks. Of course, there's a big crossover because what's happening in the economy and how bank shares perform. Shares of the biggest U.S. banks have been on a tear this year, with all but Morgan Stanley outpacing the S&P 500. Now, J.P. Morgan, Citi, and Wells Fargo kick off earnings season today. So let's get more from Bloomberg's Jenny Surain. Jenny, I mean, after years of benefiting from these higher rates, banks have to readjust to this, possible lower rates. How will that show up in today's earnings?
I think there's a few things that we're looking for. So the big number for them, as usual, is net interest income, which is basically a measure of how much income, how much interest they're generating from loans, but also shows how much they're paying out to depositors to keep them happy. Banks have been saying for a while now that for years and years that measure was actually benefiting from higher rates. Now rates have been so high for so long, they're facing a lot of pressure from customers to pay up or they're going to leave, and it's also starting to blunt loan demand. And so we're expecting that number today to not look so hot for these banks. In some cases, it'll be at its lowest level in many, many years. And then I think kind of on the go-forward basis, we're really looking at their outlook. So basically quarter after quarter, a lot of these banks have brought that down and have basically said, net interest income is not the generator that it was just a few quarters ago. So I think we're just looking for more and more commentary around how they're kind of navigating this environment.
What do we know about the investment bank fees? So again, what does it tell us about this recovery, in the capital markets?
I think, the U.S. seems to actually be doing pretty well in terms of that revival in deal making and a little bit better activity on the capital market side. So we should see good numbers today. That being said, it's all compared to a year ago when things were still in the doldrums. So you might see these huge increases. Like I think Citigroup, for instance, is expecting like a 50% increase or something, really insane like that. And if they do, end up putting that up, that's great. But it's really on a comparative basis, not that great because it's still a long cry from where we were just a few years ago and obviously in the kind of normal years leading up to the pandemic.
And Morgan, it's actually quite interesting when you look at, U.S. economy and U.S. data to look at the banks because they almost have a more immediate view on what they see in like loans and loan books and also, their customers.
Yes, absolutely. I think what we're seeing also in the market is the high performance of banks, but markets is really looking for a new catalyst, and the banks will have a tremendous impact on the rest of the economy in terms of stimulating new investments. So the rates for consumers will also impact the trends on the housing market and ultimately shelter inflation. So yeah, it has a massive impact, but in terms of other catalysts, we're seeing that the market is really focused still on AI and tech to give this new breadth to break the recent records.
What can you tell us, Jenny, about regulation? So the big U.S. banks have been really pushing back against some of the new capital rules known as Basel III. Only on Friday mornings we talk about Basel III that are supposed to be implemented this year. So what can we hear from them? But we also, Jay Powell in the testimony kind of seemed to suggest that maybe they'll be watered down.
Yeah, I think that's right. So a lot of the commentary we've gotten from the regulatory side has been that it won't be as onerous or it won't be quite as bad as banks originally had feared. I still think we'll hear a lot of complaining from them today. And I think it gets to your point, actually, about kind of the health of the U.S. consumer and what this says about the economy. When banks were making these arguments, a lot of their argument was about, if you put these rules on us, we won't be able to lend. We won't be able to be kind of there for consumers in their times of trouble. You could say, I guess, that it seems to have worked based on some of the recent comments out of Jay Powell and others. So we'll see. I think it's still many, many months away from being implemented, but I think we'll still hear a lot of complaining out of these banks today on that front.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. We'll be watching very, very closely. Thank you both for joining us. I was Bloomberg's Jenny Serrain, who covers, of course, who's in charge of bank coverage for us, and Morgan Deladon from Global X. Coming up, Tesla shares tumble after reports its much-anticipated Robotaxi is stuck in traffic. We have the latest next, and this is Bloomberg. Welcome back, everyone. Tesla shares tumbling after the company postponed the unveiling of its highly anticipated Robotaxi until October to allow more time to build additional prototypes. Now, this is a picture. This is actually, I think, yesterday's session. I think pre-market. It's down also a touch, but we'll speak to Craig Trudell, our auto czar. So this is pre-market, down 2.2% right now. But it's incredible the run that it's had over the last month. So let's bring in our card czar, Bloomberg's Craig Trudell. So first of all, Craig, good morning. What do we know actually about this delay?
So this was a date that was set, I think, back actually in April. It was around the time that there were reports coming out about the next generation electric vehicle that Tesla had been talking about for years, about trying to bring a $25,000 car to market, this idea that was kind of being pushed off to the side. And I think Musk, interestingly, sort of disputed whether or not that was true, but then sort of reinforced it by saying, all right, August 8th, I'm going to show this Robotaxi. And so what we know here is that rather than following through with that date, this is going to slip. This is going to go to sometime in October. Maybe rather than 8-8, we'll get 10-10. We'll see. But this is a case where the company's going to need more time to pull together prototypes for this event.
But is this so? It's either because he wants perfection, or it's because he's far behind schedule.
Well, and I think one of the interesting bits of detail that we got into yesterday's story by Dana Hole and Ed Ludlow is this idea that the design team, even just this week, was essentially told to redesign elements of this car. So I think that speaks to this idea that this is not a matter of trying to perfect things, but that this is not a fully baked vehicle. And so there needs to be more work done. It also speaks to a likelihood that this isn't going to be a case where they show it and then, boom, this thing is out on the roads. It's going to take them some time to get this to where it's road ready, and putting aside even that, a real open question of when these cars can actually start generating revenue by doing rides the way, say, Waymo is doing in San Francisco.
We have a 1 month chart. It's crazy. You were telling me that actually, I think it's gone. So we have a 3 month chart, but you were telling me in the last month it's kind of like gained 260 billion market cap. But what's incredible is also on the back of this Robotaxi news, it moved Uber and Lyft.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There's been a lot of attempts on the part of analysts and investors to sort of get their arms around to what extent would a Tesla Robotaxi be disruptive to an Uber or a Lyft, because what Musk has talked about here is trying to build a fleet that Tesla itself would run. And that sounds a whole lot like what, Travis Kalanick wanted to do way back in the day. So whether or not they can actually pull that off, I think is an open question. But it is something that could
watch
pose
this
a threat.
space.
Exactly.
This is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. President Biden vows to remain in the presidential race, but two crucial gaffes at the NATO summit deepen concerns about his abilities. U.S. inflation cools to its slowest pace since 2021, fueling bets that the Fed will cut interest rates at least twice this year. Plus, Tesla shares fall after it postpones its planned Robotaxi unveiling to October in a blow to Elon Musk's autonomy drive. So let's return now to the NATO summit, where U.S. President Joe Biden has vowed that he will remain in the 2024 presidential race despite two critical mistakes in the span of 2 hours, deepening concerns about his mental acuity. Now, for more on this, we're joined by Sarah Bufkin, Associate Professor at the University of Birmingham, and Bloomberg's Kevin Whitelaw in Brussels. So thank you both for joining us. Kevin, let's start with you. Is there anything that Biden at this point can do to actually move the needle in his favor?
It's just getting harder and harder. He's gotten into a cycle where every single moment, everyone's looking for that thing he's doing wrong, rather than sort of looking at the overall performance. And so his performance in the news conference was reasonably good, except for, the one or two sort of major gaffes he made when it came to misnaming people close to him. So that's what people are going to focus on. And it's really not clear what, if anything, he can do in the coming days and weeks to sort of actually allay people's fears that he, may not have the sort of mental acuity to make it through 4 years of being president. No matter how many times he says he does, no matter how many times he comes out and makes cogent arguments, all it takes is one or two moments to sort of undo sort of any progress that's been made.
Yeah, and Professor, this is a problem, right? Is that actually it was a good foreign policy speech, but actually, his gaffes instantly became viral. They became memes. So does this just get worse and worse?
Yeah, it's hard to see how, given the ways in which social media has really changed how a huge swath of the American populace consumes their news and interacts with political figures today, how Biden is going to be able to kind of put out the fire. His campaign, for as well as they prep him, for as much as he speaks eloquently about the war in Ukraine, for example, those don't make TikTok videos, right? And it becomes very easy to pick out the few instances in which he misstates someone's name, loses his train of thought mid-sentence. I mean, sometimes it seems like he's almost like stumbling over his words. Those on TikTok play incredibly well for the Trump campaign, and that's why they really want him to actually stay in the race.
Kevin, does this change the polling around Democrats versus Republicans?
Well, I mean, it's obviously hurt him in the polls to some degree. The exact amount is a little complicated to figure out. I think the bigger problem, even in the polling, is just sort of that enthusiasm question. And so much of the ultimate, sort of margins in these swing states is really going to come down to who comes out and votes. And so if there are just these really lingering concerns, it may just dent the ability and the willingness of people to go out and pull the lever for him. And so it actually makes the polling side of it pretty hard to track. At the same time, the sort of anti-Trump vote still is a pretty motivated one. So there's still a fair amount of energy there. And I think the actual deeper problem for the Democrats is they could try to switch somebody in. It's just not clear, even if they did, even if Biden somehow decided he was ready to step down, it's really not clear that there's enough time for anybody else to build the momentum and really change this around.
Can he stay in the race, Professor?
I mean, he will. If he decides he doesn't want to leave, it would take there's no institutional procedure for removing him at this stage. I mean, you can contest the convention. The last time that happened, it was a huge mess for the Democrats. If he wants to stay, it's very difficult to push him out. I think the only ways that could really work is if people close to him, as well as the Democratic congressional leadership and the Democratic donor class, say we will kind of withdraw support. And at this point, the anti-Trump vote is so strong that I think there's still a chance they could rally behind the broader administration as a project rather than behind the man.
But Dr. Bufkin, who does he listen to? Again, I know his wife is kind of, in certain circles portrayed as Lady Macbeth. It can't be all up to her. Does he listen to senators? Does he have an inner circle? Does he listen to allies?
He certainly does have an inner circle, and I think that inner circle has circled the wagons in the last week. A lot of it's family related, but it's also aides he's relied on since the beginning of his Democratic career, so going back 30, 40 years. But at this stage, I do think that, he's given indications and people close to him have given indications that if the polling numbers really change, and they have shifted since the debate, but not significantly. They've changed about the same amount that they changed against Trump when he was convicted of his felonies. But if Biden really starts to believe that he doesn't have a route to victory, I think he could potentially be more motivated to step down. But at this stage, the polling data is not giving us that. And particularly when you think about the question of turnout, this is going to be a turnout election in key states. We saw that with Hillary's loss to Trump in 2016. And currently, Biden's projected path to victory that his aides are pushing for is going through some of the swing states that she lost on turnout issues.
Kevin, how do you see this playing out? I know this is a big question, but and why is he staying in the race? Is there really a fundamental belief that he thinks he's the only one that can beat Donald Trump, or is it a rivalry between, with previous presidents that had 2 terms?
No, I think most of it is. In 2020, he was absolutely convinced that he was the best person, maybe the only person poised and positioned to be able to beat Trump, and he won. And I think he's gone into this election with the exact same, calculation. I think some of the aides around him, his family, may also be thinking about some of those broader legacy issues, and there even may be this calculation that this is part of what keeps him going. It's part of what keeps him motivated, is this job and this mission that he's got. So, I think it's all wrapped up in all of those things. He thinks he can beat Trump because he did it once before. I think the problem is you've got more and more Democrats, more and more donors disagreeing with him at this point. And for every one more person you have coming out and saying it's time for him to step down, those are clips that, should he stay in the race, the Republicans and the Trump campaign are going to play again and again and again. And it's going to just make that narrative even tougher for Biden as the election nears.
If he were to step down, Sarah, when's the right time for him to do it, to enable, a new candidate to come through? And is it automatically the vice president?
It's not automatically the vice president, and I think it shouldn't automatically be the vice president. We're really in an unprecedented territory, so the Democratic Party would actually have to figure out at this stage what would be the most democratic, deliberative, and inclusive way to decide on a replacement nominee. At this point, if he's going to step down sooner rather than later is obviously the time to do it. If you get to the next debate shortly before the election, at that point, it'd be very difficult to put forth an alternative Democratic candidate that had anything like the buy-in of either the party or a broader electorate.
This NATO summit, Sarah, had to go well for, I guess, NATO and allies. Are we going to see more pressure now that it's over for him to step down?
I think so. It's interesting, too, to see where the pressure is coming from. It's largely moderate Democrats in contested seats. The Congressional Black Caucus still remains largely, not sort of full-throatedly, but behind him. And so I do think now that all the attention is off of Biden in the U.S. during the NATO summit, we'll see more people coming out of the cracks, particularly on the House side where they're running for re-election this year. Will it be enough?
And Kevin, how many people are asking whether he's fit for president now?
Well, I think a lot of people are, whether they're doing it in public or doing it in private. Throughout that whole NATO summit, every NATO leader would have been paying extra close attention to it. They both want to figure out how he's doing, but they also were trying to figure out, is he good? Does he have a chance of pulling out an election victory? For NATO, for the allies, this is a very important election. The fate of Ukraine potentially hangs in the balance. It's not clear at all that Donald Trump, should he win another term, would sustain anything like the level of support that the U.S. has for Ukraine now, either financially or militarily. And in fact, for the rest of Europe, as they look to the role that the U.S. has long had in helping provide security in Europe, facing the Russian threat, even that now starts to come into question with another Trump term. And I think we saw this episode just overnight with this plot being revealed against the potentially alleged Russian plot to assassinate the CEO of a large German ammunition and military equipment maker, Rheinmetall. Another reminder that there are active levels of threats that the Europeans are seeing and warning about and combating. And the U.S., which helped identify this plot, has been an absolutely key partner in this up to now.
But so, Dr. Bufkin, is it then really hard to, get rid of Joe Biden as a Democratic candidate and keep him as president until November 5th?
I don't think so. I think in many respects what would be the most straightforward for the Democratic Party is to keep Biden as president until November, and for him to sort of step aside in the campaign. I think that is unlikely. That's my cards on the table, to be honest, at this stage. And I think what we're going to see is kind of the slow unfolding of more of these concerns over Biden's age, of polling numbers that go up and down until it becomes too late to make a move.
So you think he's a presidential candidate for the Democrats come November 5th?
I do. I think we're in a position in which the infrastructure around how incumbent presidents can pursue their kind of candidacies really decided this one for Biden. Kind of, the time for the Democrats to intervene would have been 18 months ago.
Okay, so interesting. Thank you both for joining us here. Bufkin there, associate professor at the University of Birmingham, and Bloomberg's Kevin Whitelaw. Coming up, President Macron's efforts to defuse France's political crisis is also highlighting deep divisions and weighing on economic uncertainty. We'll get the latest from Paris next, and this is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the Pulse, everyone. Now, Kenya's president has dismissed most of his cabinet after deadly protests against his plan to raise more than $2 billion in new taxes. William Ruto had been trying to stabilize his government's finances and gain access to new funding from the IMF. Now, for more on all of this, Bloomberg's David Maligna joins us now. So, David, this was a huge surprise to many that actually don't follow Kenya that closely. Why did he dismiss his cabinet?
The straight-up answer is the demonstrators asked for it. They had been on the streets of Nairobi and some of the other cities in Kenya protesting against this hugely controversial bill where he was raising taxes on a lot of things, including basic items like bread and diapers. So they came out on the street. They said, we don't want the bill, withdraw it. Yeah. And they also asked for the government to leave. So he withdrew the bill, which in itself was a huge statement. And then he let most of his cabinet go. And as things stand, at the top, it's just him, the deputy president, whose role is protected by law, and then the prime cabinet secretary, who that was as a foreign minister.
So what's the way going forward? Actually, was this a good bill? He had to also please IMF if you were going to get outside investments. So what was he put forward a mistake, or was it just tough on the population but the right thing to do? From
where he took off from when he came to power, Kenya's economy was in a difficult state. It was heavily indebted. The currency was, sliding against the dollar almost every other day for quite a while. There were net flows from the stock exchange. So it was a bad, place to be in. Mm-hmm. So he came up with this fiscal consolidation plan. He said, bear with me, it's going to be tough. And frankly, it was kind of working. He had a plan, and we saw that the fiscal deficit was actually narrowing. But it looks like he might have gone a little bit too far in terms of raising revenue at a time when, the economy and things were really tough for people.
Watch this space. David, thank you so much for joining us. David Maligna there, of course, all over this news from Kenya that took a lot of investors by surprise. Now, after the French snap election resulted in a hung parliament, President Macron's call to build a majority from a centre-left and centre-right parties has been rejected. The left-wing alliance, a new Popular Front, insists that they have the mandate to nominate a prime minister. Meanwhile, Bloomberg has also learned that France will need to find 15 billion euros in savings or revenue to meet EU demands.
It was an historic gamble.
Emmanuel Macron calling a snap election following his party's crushing defeat in Sunday's European Parliament elections.
And it surprised everyone. And just a month later,
we have a hung parliament scenario. This is the first time no one is getting an absolute majority in the National Assembly.
So why'd Macron risk it in the first place? It was a dangerous election a president didn't have to call and would trigger panic in the country's vital bond market. So what sparked Macron's great gamble? And what does the outcome mean for Europe's second biggest economy?
Many very good questions. So joining us now from Paris is our bureau chief, Alan Katz. Alan, Macron's idea of a centrist alliance has floundered. So where are we in the negotiations to form a government? And good morning to you.
Good morning to you too, Fran. Francine. I mean, we're really not any further than we were at the beginning of the week. As you mentioned, the parties on both the left and the right have rejected Macron's call to sort of form a broad coalition. He put that in an editorial that he sent to the regional press in France the other day. They've said no. They really reject the idea that he could sort of decide, after having called this election and his party not having won and having lost a bunch of seats in parliament, that he could then decide sort of who gets to form a government or not. So we're really, in many ways, at a stalemate. Now, a stalemate. It's only been a week since the election. For people who are used to coalition governments, they often take a very long time to form, to come together. And so things could still unblock, but for the moment, there is really no progress to be seen on the creation of a French government.
Yeah, and Alan, congratulations to you and your team. I know you're working the phones, you have great sources, and according to these sources, whoever is in the next government will need to find 15 billion euros in either savings or new taxes to satisfy EU budget rules. How difficult would it be to find that sum, also given the manifestos?
So very hard. The manifestos all call for actually higher spending, including the manifesto of Macron's party when it was running. You know, in elections all the time, you will always offer, most parties offer some sort of promises to the electorate, and this is no exception. French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire, who will be leaving at some point, but is still in position at the moment, has outlined a whole series of cuts to French spending that, in fact, go a long way toward meeting that 15 billion euro a year goal, but he's not going to be around for that much longer. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that 15 billion is essentially an opening statement from the European Commission. France is in the excessive deficit procedure with the EU, and so the EU is pressing it to try to reduce its spending in order to try to meet that deficit reduction goal. When there is a new government in place, there will be negotiations over the speed, the rate at which France tries to meet that goal. There might even be really sort of frontal conflict on whether France tries to meet that goal or not. But all of that, it's very hard to tell right now what that would be, because we don't really know the composition of what the government will be, nor what its spending and possibly even savings plans might be.
Yeah, and I guess the worries about the fiscal position of France are getting more acute.
They certainly are. I mean, one of the things that this election has done is it's really put a brake on business investment and fundraising for tech companies, and that in turn is going to have a knock-on effect on tax receipts that the government raises, not immediately, but down the road, tax receipts that the government raises. And so, the longer that this sort of instability lasts, the more delicate France's public finances become, as well as its economic growth outlook. And that, in turn, is going to have an impact on its deficit levels and how it interacts with the European Union. So the longer you have instability, the worse it is, really, for France on an economic level and on a sort of a reputational level.
Thank you so much. Alan Katz there, of course, our Paris bureau chief, and we'll have plenty more throughout the day on France and some of the troubles ahead. Coming up, a big weekend for sports fans. England take on Spain in the Euro finals. We talk the business of sport next, and this is Bloomberg. Now, the England men's football team will take on Spain in the Euro 2024 final in Berlin on Sunday. With the tournament estimated to reach 5 billion people, the Euros is big business. So let's discuss what it could mean for European equities with Joe Easton from our stocks team. Joe, I mean, we all need good weather and England to win, and that's it. We're like a Mediterranean country. What stocks could be impacted?
Yeah, so I think the area we tend to look at first would be the pubs. Quite an obvious one, given we all like to get in the pub and cram in and complain about how we can't see the screen, but get in there anyway. So there's some good research. Some of the analysts like to have fun with this one, and there's a good note out from Morgan Stanley showing that when England do well, you do see a notable increase in beer volumes in pubs, and that translates to earnings. things. Not only when
even with winter weather.
Well, yeah, maybe the Winter World Cup that was an exceptional. Well, I mean, winter now, yeah, you rightly say, yeah, to be fair. And then, the more obvious ones, the hotels in Germany. That there was another note out from MS as well, saying that the average price of a hotel room in Germany in the third week of June, when there was 24 teams in the tournament, that was 30% higher than the weekly average. So you see a big jump. All those people want to stay in the same place. It has impacts on those leisure stocks. That's the first place to look.
Yeah, we have a prime minister who also loves football and loves artisanal. I mean, in her first week in office, it's not bad.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think he made the joke that with the Labour government coming in, the England team has had this turnaround in the performance. So it was a good little line from him. I like that. But as you say, he's an Arsenal fan, and I think he actually gave Joe Biden an Arsenal shirt when he went over to Washington. I'm not sure if Joe Biden is a big football fan or soccer, if he would call it, but Keir Starmer is a genuine football lover. He plays five-a-side every week. You can see him down at the Power League or whatever it is, playing football every week. So he's generally into it. So it's quite fun to see.
Yeah, it is fun. And you're going to the game.
I am. Yeah, I'm spending my life savings
and found flights.
Yeah. So
I'm sure they were cheap, Joe.
Well, yeah. Well, there's literally not any flights at all from London to Germany available anywhere. So I'm flying to Prague, and then I've got to get a bus from Prague into Germany, and then a train from Dresden in Germany to Berlin. So that's going to be around 24 hours of travel with a brief sleep in Prague. And then come back. I've got to stay until Tuesday, because how unfortunate that is to stay in Germany and drink German beer for an extra 2 days, because there's no flights until Tuesday. So I've got to stay. So, it's difficult for my team leader to deny me the holiday for
It
that
is,
one.
but it's all in the name of research. So
exactly,
you can come back and we can cross live on Monday morning. And do you think they'll win?
Yeah. I think that if we play how we played for that half an hour in the semi-final, the beginning half an hour, I think we'll beat anyone. But given Spain with Rodri in midfield and the wingers Yamal, I think logic tells me that we're going to lose. But I think that there's hope, and your favourite Jude Bellingham, maybe he comes up with something last minute once again, another bicycle kick, or Ollie Watkins, a moment of magic. We could do it.
He is really the best, and others. Joe, thank you so much, Joe Easton. They're talking about a pretty eventful sports weekend. Up next, the Bloomberg Brief with Danny Berger and Manus Crime. This is Bloomberg.